Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big ideas using the original source material. So, propaganda. It's a word we hear a lot, but what is it really? It's not just persuasion. At its most extreme, it's a weapon. And today, we're going to open up the playbook of history's most notorious propaganda machine to see exactly how it turned an entire nation into an instrument of war.
And that brings us to the core question for today. How does propaganda actually turn ideas into actions? We're going to dive into one of history's most terrifying examples, the Nazi propaganda machine. But here's the thing, we're not just looking at this as a one-off historical event. We're going to deconstruct it as a repeatable system, a playbook for manipulation that's designed to do exactly that, turn ideas into actions.
So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to look at this through two different but totally connected lenses. On one hand, you've got the strategist's rules. Think of this as the actual playbook, the principles laid out by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And on the other hand, we've got the psychological triggers. These are the built-in cognitive biases, the mental shortcuts, that are inside all of our brains, which this playbook was specifically designed to exploit.
All right, so let's jump right into the playbook itself, into the master plan. The first thing you need to understand is that this was not random, not at all. It followed a really deliberate three-part story, a narrative arc that was designed from the ground up to systematically reshape how an entire nation saw the world.
And that whole plan, it really boils down to this three-step process you see here. Deify the leader, define the enemy, and mobilize the masses. I mean, it sounds almost deceptively simple, but it is incredibly powerful. Think about it. First, you build a god. Second, you create a devil. And third, you convince everyone to follow that god and go destroy the devil. So let's break down each of these steps one by one.
Okay, so step one, building the leader. This is all about turning a politician into a messiah. The first act in this playbook was all about elevating one person, Adolf Hitler, from just, a political leader into this infallible, almost godlike figure. This was way beyond just winning votes. The goal here was to demand absolute, unquestioning faith. So how do you actually deify a leader? Well, visually, the propaganda used really specific tricks to build this cult of personality. You'd see Hitler bathed in light, which creates this kind of holy, almost halo-like effect. He's often shown in this authoritative, shepherd-like pose, guiding his flock. And this last one is so important. He is always surrounded by these huge, adoring crowds. And that sends a really powerful message, right? It says, look, everyone believes in this guy.
And here you can see that perfect connection between the strategy and the psychology. Goebbels' Principle 12 basically said, hey, propaganda is way easier if you use a leader who already has some prestige. Why? Because that tactic directly pulls on two really powerful cognitive biases. First is the halo effect. That's where, if we have one positive impression of someone, it just kind of spills over and we assume they're good at everything else too. And then there's the authority bias, which is just our natural built-in tendency to follow the lead of someone we see as an authority figure.
Okay, so once you've built up your leader into this messiah figure, the playbook says you need a next step. You need a target. You have to create an enemy for all the nation's fears, all its frustrations and anxieties to be projected onto. After all, a savior is only as powerful as the devil he's saving you from, right?
And this wasn't some subtle process. Not at all. This quote from the Nuremberg trials, it makes it chillingly clear. This was a calculated, completely deliberate campaign. The goal wasn't just to, disagree with an opponent. The clear and expressed purpose was to enrage Germans and to justify whatever measures were taken against them. It was about manufacturing hate. So what's the psychological hack they used to do this? It's something called trait ascription bias. It's basically one of our brain's most dangerous shortcuts. It's our tendency to see other people, especially people we consider part of an outgroup, as having these really simple, fixed, and predictable traits. And you can see how this bias makes it incredibly easy to create and spread harmful stereotypes.
And the techniques they used were just so methodical. First, they used selection bias. They'd only show these awful, grotesque caricatures to create a totally distorted image. Then, they tapped into our negativity bias. That's our natural tendency to pay way more attention to negative or threatening stuff. They knew scary images stick in your head. Put those together, and you create a clustering illusion where people start seeing these sinister patterns of evil that just aren't actually there. And the final move? They'd just lump all the enemies together. Jews, Bolsheviks, the Allies. They were all merged into this one single monstrous threat that had to be destroyed.
And this is the crucial point. This is the big strategic payoff for all that work. Once you've established a really clear us versus them, you can activate a really powerful self-serving bias for your side, for the in-group. It's perfect, right? All of our successes, all of our good qualities, that's because of us. But all the failures, all the problems, we can just blame those on them.
Okay, so that brings us to the final terrifying act of the playbook: mobilizing the people. This is where you turn a whole nation into an instrument. See, it's not enough for people to just believe this stuff. They have to be pushed to act on those beliefs, no matter how horrific those actions are.
And again, Goebbels himself was brutally, chillingly honest about this. He said, news policy is a weapon of war. Its purpose is to wage war and not to give out information. I mean, there it is, right? The entire media machine wasn't there to inform anybody. It was there to function as a weapon. Its only purpose was to get people to move.
And getting the public to go along with this, it wasn't a single event. It was a step-by-step process, a kind of psychological conditioning. First, you create and reinforce that strong in-group identity, the hardworking German family. Then you create this feeling of a shared destiny, this sense that we're all in this together and things are moving forward. Step 3, you encourage silence and conformity, so anyone who disagrees feels isolated and even scared. And the final, awful step, you justify horrible actions by framing them as necessary, as a sacrifice for some greater, more immediate good.
And this whole process, from top to bottom, is really rooted in creating a powerful in-group bias. Because once we really strongly identify with our own group, it just becomes psychologically so much easier to dehumanize, to dismiss, and ultimately, to harm anyone who's outside of that group.
And one of the most chilling examples of this was how they used a bias called hyperbolic discounting. Basically, our brains prefer immediate rewards over future ones. The propaganda twisted this by framing atrocities, like the so-called euthanasia program that murdered disabled people, as an immediate economic payoff. They literally said, look how much money we'll save right now. This makes a truly horrifying act seem like a rational, short-term solution, and it helps people completely override their long-term moral compass.
So now that we've kind of deconstructed this whole playbook piece by piece, what are the big takeaways? We can actually distill this entire complex strategy into a pretty simple but really powerful checklist that you can use to recognize these patterns today.
And this checklist really puts it all together. What's so powerful here is seeing the direct line from the tactic to the psychological trigger it pulls. For the leader, you deify them to trigger the halo effect and authority bias. For the enemy, you define and stereotype them to trigger trait ascription and the clustering illusion. For the masses, you create that us versus them mentality to trigger in-group bias and the bandwagon effect. And for action, you justify harm for immediate gain, which triggers hyperbolic discounting and self-serving bias. It's a 4-part formula for manipulation, plain and simple.
When you boil it all down, the power of this playbook came from its really deep, almost intuitive understanding of human psychology. The Nazis didn't have to invent new ways for people to think. They just had to hijack the mental shortcuts and the social biases that are already there in all of us. And the glue that held the whole thing together was one of the most powerful social urges we have, the bandwagon effect. That deep-seated need to just go along with the crowd and avoid being left out.
And so that leaves us with a final, really crucial question to think about. This playbook, deify the leader, define the enemy, mobilize the masses, it isn't just some dusty historical artifact. These patterns are timeless and they are dangerous. And understanding how they work is the first and maybe the most essential step we can take to recognize them and resist them wherever and whenever they might appear today.